Hello, watchers. This email came from Gary, a 42-year-old plumber from Manchester, and it started with 5 words that made my blood run cold. I married a bar girl. What happened next isn't your typical cautionary tale. It's worse. Before we get into it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I always read them. Telling these stories isn't always easy, but if they've meant something to you, there's a super thanks button under the video. It helps keep this channel alive, and I'm truly thankful for the encouragement. Gary had been dreaming of Thailand for years. After his divorce from Sarah became final in 2019, after 20 years of what he called gray Manchester mornings and even grayer conversations, he finally booked that ticket to Phuket. The construction business was good to him. He'd built up a decent savings account, owned his flat outright, and at 42, felt like he deserved something more than Sunday roasts and arguments about the telly. I stepped off that plane in Phuket, and I swear the air itself felt different, Gary wrote. Everything was warm, the weather, the smiles, the energy. I'd been living in black and white for so long, I'd forgotten what color looked like. He booked a week at a mid-range hotel in Patong Beach. Nothing fancy, just clean sheets and a balcony overlooking the chaos of Bangla Road. The first few days were exactly what he'd imagined. Beach lounging, cheap massages, Thai food that actually tasted like something. But it was the nightlife that really opened his eyes. I'm not proud of this, but I was lonely as hell, he admitted. 20 years of marriage ending with her telling me I was boring, that I never took risks, that I was afraid of living. Well, here I was in Thailand, wasn't I? That felt like living to me. The bars of Bangla Road were unlike anything in Manchester. The music, the lights, the beautiful women who seemed genuinely interested in talking to a middle-aged plumber from England. For the first time in years, Gary felt attractive, interesting, alive. On his 4th night, Gary wandered into a go-go bar called Paradise. The name would prove ironic later, but that night it felt accurate. The place was typical. Loud music, spinning poles, girls in bikinis, but one dancer caught his attention immediately. Her name was Jessa, and she was 26 years old, though she looked younger. Unlike the other girls who seemed to be going through the motions, Jessa had this energy about her, this genuine smile that reached her eyes. When she wasn't dancing, she was laughing with the other girls or helping the older mama-san with paperwork. She was different from the start, Gary wrote. When I bought her a drink and asked her to sit with me, she didn't immediately start touching my leg or asking for expensive cocktails. She asked me about Manchester, about the weather, about why I was in Thailand alone. Real questions, like she actually cared about the answers. Jessa's English was surprisingly good. She'd studied at university in Bangkok before family circumstances forced her to drop out. Her father had died in a motorcycle accident, leaving debts that sent her family's small farm into foreclosure. Her mother was raising Jessa's younger brother and sister, ages 14 and 16, both still in school. I work here because I have to, she told him simply. But I don't want to work here forever. I want to open a small restaurant, maybe near the beach, serve real Thai food, not tourist food. The honesty was refreshing. No sob story, no manipulation, just facts presented matter-of-factly. Gary found himself staying until closing time, not because he was drunk, but because he was genuinely enjoying the conversation. When it came time to leave, Jessa didn't ask him to pay her bar fine. She gave him her phone number and said, "If you want to see real Phuket tomorrow, not tourist Phuket, I can show you. But only if you want to be friends first." Gary walked back to his hotel that night feeling something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The next day, Jessa picked him up on her little Honda scooter. She took him to local markets where she translated and haggled for him, to a temple where her grandmother had prayed, to a small family restaurant where the owner knew her by name, and the tom yum was unlike anything he'd tasted. She introduced me to her Thailand, Gary wrote. Not the Thailand they sell to tourists, but the real place where real people live and work and dream. For the first time since my divorce, I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself. Over the remaining 3 days of his trip, Gary saw Jessa every day. He paid her bar fine each night, not for sex, but so she could spend time with him without losing money. They talked for hours about everything: her dreams of restaurant ownership, his construction business, their families, their disappointments and hopes. On his last night, as they sat on Kata Beach watching the sunset, Jessa took his hand. "I know you have to go back to England," she said, "but maybe you don't have to forget about Thailand." Gary flew home with her phone number, a head full of memories, and something that felt dangerously close to love. Back in Manchester, everything felt smaller. His flat seemed cramped, the weather was impossibly gray, and his work felt mundane after the vibrancy of Thailand. But what really got to him was the silence. After a week of constant conversation with Jessa, coming home to an empty flat was crushing. They started video calling every day. Jessa would call him before her shift at the bar, and he'd call her when she got home. The time difference meant he was often talking to her at 2 a.m. his time, but he didn't care. Those conversations became the highlight of his day. "She'd show me her neighborhood on video calls," Gary wrote. Her tiny apartment that she shared with 2 other girls, the street food stall where she bought dinner, the internet cafe where she'd go to talk to me when her phone data ran out. It was real life, not the fantasy version of Thailand I'd experienced as a tourist. 3 months after his return, Jessa's messages started carrying more weight. Her mother was sick, something with her kidneys that required expensive treatment. The bar wasn't paying well because tourist season was over. Her younger brother needed money for school supplies. Gary didn't hesitate. He sent £500 through Western Union, enough to cover the medical bills and school expenses. Jessa cried on their next video call, telling him he was the kindest man she'd ever met. "That felt good," Gary admitted. "Better than anything I'd felt in years. I was helping someone I cared about, making a real difference in her life. Sarah used to say I was useless, that I never contributed to anything meaningful." Well, here was proof she was wrong. The money transfers became regular. £200 here for a family emergency, £300 there for her mother's continuing treatment, £150 for her brother's school fees. It added up to about £800 a month, which was manageable for Gary. He was living simply, saving money for his next trip to Thailand, and feeling good about helping Jessa work toward her restaurant dream. After 6 months of daily calls and monthly transfers, Gary booked his return ticket to Phuket. This time, he planned to stay for 3 weeks. Jessa met him at the airport with a bouquet of flowers and tears in her eyes. She'd lost weight, he noticed, and looked tired, but her smile was as bright as he remembered. The taxi ride to his hotel was filled with rapid-fire updates about her family, her work, her dreams for their time together. "I've been counting the days," she told him. "I quit the bar last week. I saved enough money, with your help, to take 3 weeks off. I want to spend every minute with you." For the first week, it felt like a fairy tale. They explored islands Gary had never seen, ate at local restaurants where Jessa knew the owners, and spent long afternoons on quiet beaches talking about the future. Jessa talked about her restaurant plans with increasing detail. She'd found a location, negotiated with landlords, even started designing a menu. She had it all figured out, Gary wrote. The startup costs, the suppliers, the staff she'd need. It was inspiring to see someone so young and ambitious working toward a real goal. I started thinking about what role I might play in that future. On his second week, Jessa took him to meet her family. The trip to her village in Aisan province required an overnight bus journey and opened Gary's eyes to a side of Thailand he'd never seen. The poverty was real, but not desperate. Clean homes with basic amenities, rice fields stretching to the horizon, and a pace of life that felt both ancient and peaceful. Jessa's mother was exactly as described: kind, hardworking, and clearly proud of her daughter's ability to support the family. Her younger siblings were shy but curious about the Farang, who'd been helping with school fees. The family treated Gary like royalty, cooking elaborate meals they clearly couldn't afford and refusing to let him pay for anything. "That's when I knew I loved her," Gary wrote. Not just the idea of her, but actually her. Seeing her with her family, seeing how much they depended on her, and how seriously she took that responsibility. She wasn't just beautiful or exotic, she was good. Really, genuinely good. On their last night in the village, as they sat outside under more stars than Gary had ever seen in Manchester, he made a decision that would change everything. "Jessa," he said, taking her hand, "I want to marry you." She stared at him for a long moment, then started crying. "Are you serious? You really want to marry me?" "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," he replied. She said yes through her tears, and they spent the rest of the night planning their future together. The wedding planning began immediately. Jessa wanted two ceremonies, a small legal one for the paperwork and a traditional Thai ceremony for her family and community. Gary was happy to oblige, though the costs quickly escalated beyond what he'd expected. "It started with reasonable requests," Gary wrote. "A few £1,000s for the ceremonies, money for her family to host the village celebration, wedding clothes, flowers, food." But then came the other requests. Jessa's family needed a new roof before the rainy season. Her brother had been accepted to a better school, but needed tuition money. Her mother's medical treatment required ongoing payments. The restaurant location Jessa had found was available now, but only if they could put down a deposit immediately. Gary found himself liquidating his savings account, then taking out a loan against his flat. Within 2 months of his proposal, he'd sent over £25,000 to Thailand. "I justified it all," he admitted. "This was my future wife. Her family was becoming my family, and the restaurant was our joint investment. It felt like building something real together." The legal wedding ceremony was small and sweet, held at the district office in Phuket town with just Jessa's mother and a few friends as witnesses. But the traditional ceremony in her village was elaborate. A 3-day celebration that seemed to involve half the province. Gary felt like a celebrity. Everyone wanted to meet the Farang who was marrying their local girl. Everyone had stories about other foreigners who'd found love in Thailand. Everyone assured him he was getting the best wife in all of Aizen. "It was intoxicating," Gary wrote. "I felt like I'd accomplished something extraordinary. Here I was, a divorced plumber from Manchester, and I'd found real love in an exotic place. I was living the dream that every middle-aged Western man secretly harbors." But other expats tried to warn him. At a bar in Patong, 3 different men pulled him aside to share their own stories of Thai wives and lost money. An Australian named Dave was particularly blunt. "Mate, I've been here 8 years. I've seen this exact story 50 times. Be careful." Gary dismissed their warnings as jealousy or bitterness from men who'd made poor choices. His situation was different. Jessa was different. Their love was real. The red flags were there, but he chose not to see them. Living together full-time as a married couple revealed cracks that had been easy to ignore during romantic holidays. Jessa was moody and demanding in ways she'd never been before. Small disagreements escalated into major arguments. Cultural differences that had seemed charming became sources of constant friction. "She started treating me less like a husband and more like an ATM," Gary wrote. Every conversation ended with some new expense. Her cousin needed money for a motorbike. Her aunt needed surgery. The restaurant needed new equipment before we could open. Gary tried to set boundaries, suggesting they create a budget for family support. Jessa's response was explosive. She accused him of being cheap, of not understanding Thai family obligations, of changing into a different person now that they were married. "In Thai culture, family comes first," she told him. "If you can't understand that, maybe you don't understand Thailand at all." The arguments became a pattern. Jessa would present some family emergency, Gary would hesitate or ask questions, and she'd respond with tears and accusations about his lack of love and cultural sensitivity. Inevitably, he'd end up sending the money to prove his commitment. 6 months into the marriage, Gary discovered that Jessa was still going to bars. Not working, she insisted, just socializing with her old friends. But other expats started mentioning, seeing her at places she'd claimed never to visit anymore. "I followed her one night," Gary admitted. "I'm not proud of it, but I had to know. She was at a bar in Kata, sitting with a German man who was clearly infatuated with her. She was doing the same routine she'd done with me, the innocent conversation, the genuine interest, the subtle touches. When Gary confronted her, Jessa exploded with rage. How dare he spy on her? Didn't he trust her? She was just helping a lonely tourist feel welcome in Thailand? Wasn't that better than letting him get scammed by other girls? She turned it around on me completely, Gary wrote. Suddenly, I was the bad guy for not trusting her, for being jealous and controlling, for not understanding that Thai women are naturally friendly and helpful. But the real revelation came 3 months later when Gary discovered Jessa was pregnant. At first, he was thrilled. A baby would make their family complete, give them a shared future beyond the cultural confusion and financial stress. But when he started calculating dates, the timeline didn't add up. We'd been having problems in bed for months, Gary wrote. The stress, the arguments, the constant money issues, our physical relationship had basically stopped. But she was definitely pregnant and definitely not by me. The confrontation was devastating. Through tears and broken English, Jessa admitted she'd been seeing her ex-boyfriend, a Thai man named Somchai who owned a small business in Phuket town. The baby was his, but it got worse. Gary discovered that the restaurant they'd been investing in was actually owned by Somchai. The family emergencies had been real, but the money had also been funding Somchai's business expansion. The house Gary had helped buy for Jessa's mother was in Somchai's name. I'd been funding my own replacement, Gary wrote. Every pound I'd sent to help Jessa build a future with me was actually helping her build a future with someone else. Gary returned to Manchester broke, divorced again, and emotionally shattered. He'd lost over £50,000, his marriage, and his faith in his own judgment. The flat he'd mortgaged to fund his Thai dream was now at risk. The first few months back were the darkest of my life, he wrote. I felt like the biggest fool who'd ever lived. How could I have been so blind? How could I have ignored so many warning signs? But slowly, with the help of a therapist and support from friends who'd tried to warn him, Gary began to understand what had really happened. I wasn't the victim of a simple scam, he realized. I was the victim of my own desperation and cultural arrogance. I went to Thailand looking for someone to save, someone who would make me feel important and needed. Jessa didn't create that need. She just recognized it and used it. Gary began to see how his own psychology had made him vulnerable. His failed marriage had left him feeling inadequate and boring. The divorce had damaged his self-esteem. He'd gone to Thailand seeking validation, not love. Jessa was doing what she had to do to survive and support her family, Gary wrote. In her position, with limited options and real responsibilities, maybe I would have done the same thing. The problem wasn't that she was evil. The problem was that I convinced myself that a transaction was a relationship. The cultural aspect was equally important. Gary had romanticized Thai culture without understanding it. He'd seen the surface, the smiles, the hospitality, the respect for family, without grasping the complex economic and social pressures that shaped behavior. I thought I was being open-minded and adventurous, he admitted, but I was actually being incredibly naive and patronizing. I assumed that my Western money and good intentions would be enough to bridge any gap. I never tried to really understand what life was like for someone in Jessa's position. The hardest lesson was about his own motivations. Gary had told himself he was in love, but looking back, he recognized that he'd been in love with the idea of being needed, of being the hero in someone else's story. Real love doesn't require constant proof through money, he realized. Real love doesn't make you feel desperate and anxious all the time. Real love doesn't require you to ignore red flags to maintain the fantasy. A year after returning to Manchester, Gary was rebuilding his life. He'd found a new job, was slowly paying off his debts, and had started dating a British woman his own age. The relationship was different, quieter, more equal, based on shared interests rather than rescue fantasies. I don't regret going to Thailand, Gary wrote in his final email. I regret how I went there and what I was looking for. If I'd gone as a tourist enjoying a holiday, or even as someone genuinely interested in Thai culture and people, things might have been different. His advice to other middle-aged Western men considering similar adventures was direct. Don't go to Southeast Asia looking to save someone or to be saved. Don't mistake transaction for affection, and don't ignore warning signs because they interfere with your fantasy. If you're lonely or recently divorced, deal with those issues at home before you try to solve them with an exotic relationship. Gary's story isn't unique. Across Thailand, similar dramas play out daily between Western men seeking purpose and Thai women seeking security. The tragedy isn't that these relationships exist, it's that they're so often built on mutual misunderstanding rather than genuine connection. The real Thailand is beautiful and complex, Gary concluded, but you can't understand it by staying in tourist areas and dating women who work in the entertainment industry. If you want a real relationship with a Thai woman, learn the language, understand the culture, and start with friendship rather than rescue fantasies. The most important lesson from Gary's experience might be this: love that requires constant financial proof isn't love at all. Real relationships, whether in Manchester or Phuket, are built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection, not on the dangerous combination of desperation and money that destroyed his dreams of paradise.